January 24, 1948, early morning. The courtroom was silent. Dozens of people sat on the wooden benches, watching the woman standing before the judges. Some of the faces in the room belonged to journalists and government officials, but many of them were survivors, former prisoners who had lived through the nightmare of Auschwitz concentration camp. For years, they had carried memories that were almost impossible to describe: starvation, forced labor, selections, death. And among those memories, one name appeared again and again. The woman is now standing before the court. Her name was Maria Mandl. During the war, she had been one of the most powerful women inside Auschwitz. Survivors later described her as strict, feared, and capable of deciding the fate of prisoners with only a glance or a single gesture. Now she stood quietly while the court listened to testimony about what had happened inside the camp. The woman who once helped enforce one of the most brutal systems in history was now the one being judged. But to understand how Maria Mandl arrived in this courtroom, we have to go back several years before Auschwitz, before the war reached its most violent stage, and before the world understood the full scale of the crimes being committed inside the Nazi camp system. Maria Mandl was born in 1912 in the small Austrian town of Münzkirchen. At the time, Austria was still part of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. The region was politically unstable, and the First World War would soon transform Europe forever. After the war ended in 1918, the empire collapsed. New borders appeared across Central Europe, and economic hardship spread through many countries. For young people growing up during this period, the future often seemed uncertain. Mandl grew up during this time of instability. Little is known about her early personal life, but like many young Austrians, she experienced the political tensions and economic struggles that shaped Europe during the interwar period. By the 1930s, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had risen to power in Germany. Their ideology emphasized nationalism, racial hierarchy, and loyalty to the state. These ideas quickly spread across German-speaking regions, including Austria. In 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria during the event known as the Anschluss. The annexation brought Austria directly under Nazi control and expanded the influence of the Nazi political system. For many Austrians, joining the regime offered opportunities for employment and advancement. Maria Mandl soon became part of that system. She joined the SS Women's Auxiliary Service, which supplied guards for the growing concentration camp network. Mandl's first assignment came at the women's concentration camp of Lichtenberg. Lichtenberg had originally been a castle that was later converted into a prison and eventually into a concentration camp for female detainees. In many of the prisoners held there were political opponents of the Nazi regime, women accused of resistance, dissent, or simply criticizing the government. Mandl's role as a guard required strict obedience to the SS command structure. Guards were responsible for maintaining order inside the camp. They supervised prisoners during work assignments, enforced discipline, and reported any signs of resistance. Punishments inside the camps were severe. Prisoners who broke rules could be beaten, placed in solitary confinement, or forced into even harsher labor. Mandl quickly gained a reputation among her superiors for strict discipline. Her loyalty to the SS system and willingness to enforce camp rules led to promotions. Within a short time, she was transferred to a larger and more important facility, the women's concentration camp at Ravensbrück concentration camp. Ravensbrück became one of the central camps within the Nazi system for imprisoning women. Thousands of prisoners from across Europe were held there. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jewish women, Roma women, civilians accused of opposing Nazi rule. The camp also served as a training ground for female guards. At Ravensbrück, Mandl learned the administrative structure of the concentration camp system. The camps operated through strict hierarchy and constant control. Every movement of prisoners was regulated. Work assignments were brutal. Food was scarce. Disease spread easily through overcrowded barracks. Mandl continued to rise through the ranks. Her superiors considered her disciplined and reliable. Then in 1942, she was transferred to Auschwitz. This transfer would define her place in history. At Auschwitz, Mandl became Lagerführerin, the chief supervisor of the women's camp. This position gave her enormous authority. Tens of thousands of female prisoners passed through the camp during her time there. She supervised guards, she enforced punishments, and she participated in one of the most terrifying procedures in the camp system: selections. When trains carrying prisoners arrived at Auschwitz, SS officers decided who would be sent to forced labor and who would be sent directly to the gas chambers. These decisions were often made in seconds. Witnesses later testified that Mandl participated in these selections. For prisoners standing in line, a single gesture from an officer could determine whether they would live or die. Survivor testimonies later claimed that Mandl's decisions sent thousands of women and children to their deaths. One of the most disturbing elements associated with Mandl's time at Auschwitz involved music. Mandl supported the creation of a women's orchestra inside the camp. The orchestra was made up of prisoners who were musicians. These prisoners were forced to perform music while other prisoners marched to forced labor. They played when new transports arrived. Sometimes they even played during selections. The sound of violins and other instruments echoed through the camp, while unimaginable suffering unfolded nearby. For the prisoners forced to perform, the experience was deeply traumatic. For survivors, the orchestra became one of the most haunting memories of Auschwitz. Music had been transformed into part of the machinery of oppression. By 1944, the war had begun turning against Nazi Germany. Allied forces advanced from the west while the Soviet army pushed toward Poland from the east. As the Red Army approached Auschwitz, the Nazis began evacuating camps and attempting to destroy evidence of their crimes. Many guards fled. Mandl was transferred away from Auschwitz during the final months of the war. But after Germany surrendered in May 1945, Allied investigators began searching for individuals connected to the concentration camp system. Mandl attempted to avoid capture. However, she was eventually arrested by American forces and transferred to Polish authorities. For the first time since joining the Nazi camp system, she found herself in prison. In 1947, Mandl stood trial during the Auschwitz trials in Krakow. The courtroom filled with tension as survivors testified about what they had witnessed inside the camp. Many described the brutal discipline imposed by guards. Others spoke about selections and the terror prisoners felt whenever SS officers appeared. Some witnesses spoke directly about Mandl. They described her authority within the women's camp and the fear her presence created among prisoners. For the survivors, the trial represented an opportunity to confront those who had once controlled their lives. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the court reached its decision. Maria Mandl was guilty of crimes against humanity. The sentence was death. On January 24, 1948, guards arrived at her cell in Montelupich prison. She was escorted through the corridor toward the execution chamber. Witnesses later reported that she appeared pale and tense as she approached the gallows. For someone who had once exercised power over thousands of prisoners, the moment marked a dramatic reversal of fate. The rope was placed around her neck. Moments later, the trapdoor opened. Within minutes, Maria Mandl was dead. Her execution was one of many carried out after the war, as courts across Europe prosecuted members of the Nazi regime. For survivors of the concentration camps, these trials represented an attempt to bring justice to those responsible for unimaginable suffering. Yet no trial could undo the devastation caused by the war. Millions had died, entire communities had been destroyed, and the scars left by those crimes would remain for generations. Today, the story of Maria Mandl remains a chilling reminder of how individuals became part of one of the most brutal systems ever created. She once held the power to decide the fate of prisoners inside Auschwitz, but history eventually placed her on the other side of judgment. Her execution marked the end of one life, but the memory of what happened inside the camps continues to shape how the world remembers the Holocaust. Because the events of those years were not simply history, they were warnings, and remembering them remains essential to understanding the darkest chapter of the 20th century.